You were in the queue, weren't you, for
Yes.
the gas chamber
Yeah.
with a friend,
Yeah.
but you ran away.
From snuffing out prisoners in gas chambers filled with Zyklon B
After one of those injections, I became very high fever.
to carrying out the wildest medical experiments on unsuspecting prisoners and drowning them in death-cold water, here are some of the most brutal executions meted out on prisoners by the Nazis during World War II, starting with medical experiments. Nazi medical experiments represent the most chilling perversion of the Hippocratic Oath in human history. These experiments, involving thousands of victims, were orchestrated by German physicians and SS officials under the guise of scientific advancement, but frequently served as de facto execution methods. Estimates suggest up to 15,000 people were subjected to these experiments across camps like Auschwitz, Dachau, Ravensbrück, and Buchenwald, with many thousands dying directly from the procedures.
I was used in two types of experiments.
The hypothermia experiments at Dachau from 1942 to 1943 stand as particularly brutal examples. Prisoners were immersed in tanks of ice-cold water, temperatures ranging from 2 degrees Celsius to 12 degrees Celsius for up to 5 hours, or left naked outdoors at -6 degrees Celsius. Deaths occurred via cardiac arrest, organ failure, or lethal rewarming, with doctors like Sigmund Rascher conducting these experiments on 280 to 300 victims, resulting in 80 to 100 deaths. Josef Mengelé's twin experiments at Auschwitz represent another horrifying chapter. At Auschwitz, Josef Mengele studied heredity by experimenting on approximately 3,000 twins, mostly children. Methods included injections to change eye color, surgeries without anesthesia, and organ removals. If one twin died, the other was killed with chloroform or phenol injections for comparative autopsies. Only approximately 200 twins survived out of the 3,000 subjected to these experiments.
Too bad. She's so young. She has only 2 weeks to live.
Phenol injections represent one of the most chilling examples of how Nazis perverted medical procedures into instruments of murder, earning the sinister nickname the Needle of Auschwitz. This technique involved injecting concentrated phenol directly into the victim's heart, causing rapid cardiac arrest and death. The method emerged in 1941 and was used until late 1944 as a discreet way to eliminate prisoners deemed unfit. If you thought medical experiments represented the height of Nazi cruelty, wait until you see how they industrialized death itself through their gas chamber operations. Gas chambers. Gas chambers represent the Nazi regime's most systematic approach to mass murder, transforming genocide into an industrial process that could eliminate thousands daily. During World War II, the Nazis developed systematic methods of mass murder as part of the Holocaust, with gas chambers being a key component, allowing for efficient assembly line killing while minimizing psychological strain on perpetrators. The evolution began with the Nazi euthanasia program, Action T4, in late 1939, where carbon monoxide gassing originated to kill Germans with mental or physical disabilities. 6 facilities in Germany and Austria used CO in gas chambers, with operations officially halted in August 1941 due to public protests, but continuing covertly. The transition to Zyklon B marked a significant escalation. Zyklon B, a cyanide-based pesticide invented in the 1920s, was originally used for fumigating ships and clothing against pests. The Nazis tested it in September 1941 at Auschwitz, gassing 600 Soviet POWs and 250 ill prisoners. About 56 tons were used in camps from 1942 to 1944, killing approximately 1.1 million people, mostly Jews.
You were in the queue, weren't you, for
Yes.
the gas chamber
Yeah.
with a friend,
Yeah.
but you ran away. Tell us what happened.
The process was highly organized and deceptive.
We were standing in the queue near the kitchens, and for some reason or other, we were looking at the gate, of course, the famous gate where once you got through there, you didn't come back.
Upon train arrival, SS doctors separated able-bodied for forced labor. Others were selected for death. Up to 2,000 were herded into sealed chambers where SS personnel dropped pellets through roof vents, with death occurring in 5-20 minutes. Although the industrial efficiency of gas chambers was the peak of Nazi brutality, how they turned execution into a mobile operation through mass shootings was even more brutal. Mass shootings by Einsatzgruppen. The Einsatzgruppen mass shootings represent the Holocaust by bullets, demonstrating the Nazi regime's commitment to murder on an unprecedented scale. The Einsatzgruppen consisted of 4 main groups, A, B, C, and D, totaling around 3,000 men, explicitly ordered to eliminate Judeo-Bolshevism by murdering Jews, Roma, Soviet commissars, and partisans. By the end of 1941, historians estimate that the Einsatzgruppen and collaborators were responsible for the deaths of at least 1.5 to 2 million people through mass shootings, with Jews comprising the vast majority. These killings occurred across occupied Soviet territories in collaboration with local auxiliaries. The systematic procedure followed a brutal pattern. Operations began with rounding up victims under false pretenses like resettlement or medical checks. Entire communities were marched to isolated locations, forced to undress, surrender valuables, and sometimes dig graves. Victims were lined up in groups of 10-20 at pit edges, shot in the back of the head so they fell forward into the grave. The Babi Yar massacre stands as one of the most horrific examples. Einsatzgruppe C, with Ukrainian auxiliaries, killed 33 to 771 Jews in a ravine over September 29-30, 1941. Similar massacres occurred at Rumbula near Riga and Ponary near Vilnius, where over 70,000 were killed. Bodies were layered in pits, sometimes sprinkled with lime, with graves filled by local laborers who were then killed. As the war turned against Germany, Sonderkommando 1005 units exhumed and burned bodies to erase evidence. Moving on, let's take a look at how the Nazis turned evacuations into executions through death marches. Death marches. These marches involved tens of thousands of inmates traveling long distances under brutal conditions, with more than 35% of camp prisoners perishing in this period alone. The marches affected nearly 700,000 prisoners across Europe.
When we came to the barrack, the Stubenälteste, the man in charge of the barrack, walks out.
The marches were driven by strategic and ideological motives. Nazi leaders feared surviving prisoners would reveal camp atrocities to liberating forces, with evacuations accelerated after the Soviet capture of Majdanek in July 1944. Prisoners were also seen as valuable for armaments production.
They opened the gate, it was still nighttime, and they yelled, "Leave all your belonging where it is, don't pick anything up. Women and children to the right, men to the left."
The execution methods were varied and opportunistic. Guards routinely shot prisoners who collapsed from exhaustion, illness, or injury. Prisoners marched in sub-zero temperatures with inadequate clothing and minimal rations, with many dying from hypothermia or malnutrition.
חוץ מזה קרה לנו מקרה מאוד קשה, זה היה לפני עיר באוצן, שהם אמרו שבחורה גנבה לחם, ולקחו אולי 60 בנות, והרגו את כל ה-60 בנות.
The Auschwitz evacuation in January 1945 exemplifies the horror. Approximately 60,000 prisoners were forced to march west in 20-degree weather, with 15,000 dying during the march. At Stutthof, over 50,000 prisoners were marched to the Baltic coast, with over 25,000 dying, including 5,000 forced into the sea and machine-gunned. If you thought the mass movement of death marches was brutal, imagine how they designed cells specifically to break prisoners through prolonged agony. Standing cells. Standing cells, known as Stehzellen, represent one of the most psychologically devastating torture forms, combining medieval cruelty with modern efficiency to break prisoners through prolonged agony. These were specially constructed narrow chambers built into the basement or punishment blocks, with dimensions deliberately restrictive to prevent any posture other than standing upright. While deaths were typically a byproduct rather than intentional execution, they were part of the broader extermination through labor system. The design was calculated to maximize suffering. In Auschwitz, cells measured less than 1 square meter, with 4 compartments per unit, each holding up to 4 prisoners simultaneously. In Dachau, cells were around 75 cm x 80 cm, resembling stone chimneys with minimal air circulation. Air was provided through tiny grills, but ventilation was inadequate, leading to suffocation risks, with entry through low hatches sealed with bars. The design ensured constant physical strain, with legs swelling, muscles atrophying, and circulation failing. Implementation varied by camp but followed similar cruelty patterns. At Auschwitz's Block 11, prisoners were confined overnight after full days of forced labor, repeating the cycle. Punishment could extend for 10 days or more, with minimal food, sometimes a single piece of bread every 3 days. Survivor testimonies contradict Commandant Rudolf Höss's claims of 3-night limits, reporting stays of up to 8 days. Joseph Kral endured 6 weeks, eating his shoes from desperation. Max Hoffman recalled, "This is no punishment. It is torture, straightforward medieval torture." Although the standing cells were torturous, the way they turned vehicle into death traps was more terrifying for the prisoners. Gas vans. Nazi gas vans represent a terrifying innovation in mobile genocide, bridging early shooting operations and later industrialized gas chambers. These were hermetically sealed trucks modified to pipe engine exhaust fumes into a rear compartment, asphyxiating victims locked inside. Introduced to address psychological strain on Einsatzgruppen from mass shootings, gas vans represented an early step in genocide industrialization. Gas vans emerged from the euthanasia program, Action T4, beginning in 1939, evolving into a final solution tool after the 1941 Soviet invasion. The push intensified in summer 1941 when Heinrich Himmler ordered Arthur Naber to find less stressful alternatives for perpetrators. By June 1942, 20 vans were operational, consisting of the 3.5-ton Opel Blitz, holding 2560 victims, and the 7-ton Sarah, up to 100. The rear compartment was airtight, metal-lined, with a flexible hose connecting exhaust to the compartment, pumping carbon monoxide during 10 to 20-minute drives. The operation was designed for deception and efficiency. Victims were deceived into believing they were being transported for work or baths, then loaded into vans. Doors sealed, the driver connected the exhaust hose and drove to burial sites, with screams lasting minutes before silence. Gas vans operated across occupied territories with devastating effect. At Chelmno, 150,000 plus died. In Serbia, at Sajmiste camp, 7,000 were killed in 1942. Approximately 700,000 people were killed in gas vans, with over 300,000 via the 20 standardized vans from 1941 to 1945. One SS man at Chelmno recalled, "Jews knocked and shouted, 'Dear Germans, let us out.' Bodies suffocated in 10 minutes. Bodies were described as blue, wet with sweat and urine, with personnel suffering breakdowns. And nothing terrified the prisoners more than ending up hanging to their death on a pole." Hanging on the post, strappado. The hanging on the post method, originating from medieval Inquisition practices, involved suspending victims by their wrists tied behind their backs, inflicting extreme pain through joint dislocation and muscle strain. While primarily intended as non-lethal punishment, it often resulted in permanent injury or death if prolonged. Locations where strappado was employed reveal its widespread use. At Buchenwald, 1937-1945, it was particularly infamous under SS Hauptscharführer Walter Sommer, who hung victims from trees in the Singing Forest, named for victims' screams. At Sachsenhausen, 1936-1945, victims were suspended from posts. At Mauthausen, 1938-1945, strappado was combined with mutilation. The execution process was simple yet agonizing. Victims' hands were tied behind their backs, sometimes with weights attached to their ankles. The rope was looped over a hook, with victims hoisted until their feet left the ground, arms bearing full body weight. Variations included standard strappado with steady suspension, the French variant involving repeated hoisting and dropping, and the pillar variant with hands tied above the head. Punishments lasted from minutes to full days, with guards monitoring to prevent quick death. Effects were devastating and often fatal, including shoulder dislocations, torn ligaments, compressed nerves, permanent disability, paralysis, or gangrene. If prolonged overnight, death occurred via shock, internal bleeding, or organ failure. If you thought strappado was the height of torture revival, wait until you see how they modernized execution through the precision of the guillotine. Guillotine executions. The Nazi adoption of the guillotine in 1936 represents a chilling mechanization of judicial murder, transforming individual executions into efficient bureaucratic processes. Following Hitler's directive to standardize capital punishment, the guillotine was seen as more efficient than the axe. By 1937, 20 guillotines were manufactured and distributed to prisons, modified with heavier blades, up to 40 kilolas, for quicker decapitation. The guillotine was primarily used for judicial executions following sentences from the People's Court, Volksgerichtshof. itself, presided over by judges like Roland Freisler. Victims included political dissidents, resistance fighters, Jehovah's Witnesses, deserters, and ordinary criminals. Estimates indicate over 16,500 people were executed by guillotine between 1933 and 1945, with around 10,000 occurring in 1944-1945 alone. Approximately half were German citizens, with women comprising over 4,000 executed. Prisons like Plötzensee in Berlin, nearly 3,000 executions, and Brandenburg-Gurden, over 2,000, became central killing sites. The process was standardized for maximum efficiency. The execution process followed chilling bureaucratic precision. Victims were tried in sham proceedings lasting minutes, informed shortly before execution, and allowed final meals. Prisoners were strapped face down to a wooden plank, neck placed in a lunette, with the executioner releasing the blade via lever. Efficiency allowed executions every 3 to 5 minutes, with executioner Johann Reichardt once beheading 32 people in 24 minutes. What is far scarier is how most of the prisoners preferred the swiftness of the guillotine to being flogged to death. Flogging to death. Flogging represents one of the most widespread yet underestimated methods of torture and execution in Nazi camps, serving as both a disciplinary measure and a deliberate killing technique. While not always intended as immediate execution, flogging frequently resulted in death due to the victim's weakened state from malnutrition and prior abuse. This method was part of a broader system designed to break prisoners physically and psychologically. Flogging was documented across multiple camps, including Auschwitz, Dachau, Majdanek, and early camps like Esterwagen. Reasons were often trivial: attempting to obtain extra food, shirking work, smoking, improper hygiene, or suspected sabotage. Flogging was typically public during evening roll calls to maximize humiliation and deterrence. Victims were bent over stools or wooden frames, with feet immobilized, required to count lashes in German. Miscounting restarted the process. Tools included heavy sticks, bullwhips, rubber hoses, or whips with metal tips. The official number was 25 lashes, 25 mit besten Dank, but often exceeded 75 based on perpetrators' sadism.
He says, I'm gonna teach these Schweinhund a lesson they'll never forget. I'll teach those pig dogs a lesson they'll never forget.
Sessions lasted minutes, but caused lasting trauma, with no medical aid provided. While not always explicit execution, flogging's brutality made it lethal through severe lacerations, broken bones, ruptured organs, internal bleeding, or shock.
Walk over to the sawhorse, tiptoe, bend over, but your stomach cannot touch a 2x4. Your heel cannot touch the ground. 1, 2, 3, 4. And every time they hit me, I feel a line of blood coming through my bed.
If you thought systematic flogging was the height of prolonged torture, wait until you see how they weaponized hunger itself as an instrument of slow death. Systematic starvation. Unlike direct methods like shooting or gassing, starvation was disguised as resource scarcity, serving dual purposes, eliminating undesirables while extracting forced labor until death. It was rooted in Nazi racial ideology and exacerbated by the Hunger Plan, which aimed to seize food from occupied lands. The development evolved from early camps in 1933 to become policy during the war. By 1941, with Operation Barbarossa, starvation became policy via the Hunger Plan, devised by Herbert Bacher and approved in May 1941, aimed at starving 45 million Soviets. Though not fully realized, it caused millions of deaths through artificial famine. In ghettos like Warsaw and Lodz, Jews were confined with rations as low as 420 calories a day, leading to 80,000 starvation deaths in Warsaw alone by 1942. Concentration camps integrated starvation into daily life, with rations dropping to 700 to 2,200 calories a day, often consisting of Russian bread from sawdust. Prisoners received tiered rations based on race, Germans at 100%, Poles at 76-77%, Jews at 27% for carbs. Daily intake was 1,800 calories initially, dropping to 700 for POWs, with meals like ersatz coffee, watery soup, and 300-gram black bread. Prisoners worked 12+ hours daily, burning calories rapidly, with overcrowding, no medical care, and winter exposure compounding hunger. The punitive use reached extreme form in Auschwitz's starvation cells. Hostages post-escape escape were locked without food, starving over weeks, with Maximilian Kolbe volunteering in 1941, surviving 2 weeks before phenol injection. Death occurred in 4 to 6 weeks through weight loss, weakness, immune collapse, and hunger disease. The scale was massive. 3.3 million Soviet POWs died of starvation, 4.2 million Soviet civilians, and 80,000 plus Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto. Although starvation was a slow method of murder, the Nazis did not hesitate to hang prisoners to keep them in check. Regular hanging. Hanging was employed by the Nazis as both individual execution and psychological warfare, transforming traditional capital punishment into public spectacles designed to terrorize populations into submission. Unlike mass extermination methods, hanging was typically reserved for individual punishments, often for resistance, sabotage, or escape attempts. The Nazis adapted hanging from traditional German practices but favored short-drop methods, resulting in slow strangulation rather than quick neck fracture. Nazi hangings typically involved short drop or suspension techniques, leading to death by asphyxiation over 10-20 minutes, rather than instantaneous cervical fracture. This prolonged suffering was deliberately designed to maximize deterrent effect. Infrastructure varied, but was designed for maximum visibility. In prisons like Plötzensee, steel beams with multiple hooks allowed simultaneous hangings, with victims hoisted and slowly strangled. In concentration camps like Auschwitz, portable gallows were erected in courtyards for public view. In occupied territories, improvised gallows used poles, trees, or public scaffolds for street executions. Camp hangings were sporadic but strategically timed. Hangings were public during evening roll calls to force all prisoners to witness, targeting escapees, saboteurs, or resistance members. Notable examples include July 19, 1943, when 12 prisoners were hanged in reprisal for 3 escapes. Plötzensee prison became notorious with nearly 3,000 executions by 1945, peaking at 1,180 in 1943. After 1943, RAF bombing damaged the guillotine. Hangings surged during Bloody Nights, September 7th to 12th, 1943, where approximately 250 were hanged in groups without trials. Public executions in occupied territories served as terror campaigns. In Poland, hangings were staged in streets with gallows erected at train stations and highways, bodies left dangling all day. In Radom, 1942, 50 Poles were hanged publicly, with workers forced to watch. And before you think public hangings were horrific enough for the prisoners, getting buried alive was enough to instill discipline into the prisoners. Burying alive. Burying alive represents one of the most psychologically terrifying methods employed by the Nazis, though typically not as standalone execution, but as horrific consequence of mass shooting operations during the Holocaust by bullets. This phase from 1941 to 1944 involved mobile killing squads, Einsatzgruppen, who murdered approximately 1.5 or 2 million people by shooting them into pits, often while some victims were still alive due to incomplete shootings. The practice stemmed from the Nazi shift to systematic genocide after invading the Soviet Union in June 1941, where initial targets expanded to entire communities. Burying alive amplified terror, as survivors reported hearing moans from graves or feeling movement under body layers. Archaeological efforts have identified over 2,000 mass grave sites in Ukraine alone. The method followed systematic procedures, often resulting in live burials. Victims were rounded up under false pretenses, marched to remote locations, forced to undress, then lined up at pit edges and shot. To economize, shooters aimed for necks or used single bullets for multiple victims, with bodies layered in pits and earth shoveled over, often by bulldozers. Wounded survivors were often ignored, buried alive and suffocating under weight and soil. The Babi Yar massacre stands as the most documented example. On September 29, 1941, 33,171 Jews were killed by Sonderkommando 4A, with victims shot in a ravine and buried while many were still alive, as soil moved for days. Total victims at Babi Yar reached 150,000, with a 1943 cover-up operation burning 70,000 plus bodies. Survivor testimonies provide harrowing evidence. Dina Pronicheva jumped into the ravine before being shot, played dead under bodies, and felt earth thrown on her before escaping at night. She testified, "I felt I was deafened. Earth was thrown on me." Anatoly Kuznetsov described graves breathing from trapped air and movement. Gases from decomposing bodies sometimes caused eruptions in graves, exposing the horror. Although the thought of getting buried alive would live with the survivors for years, getting mauled to death by rabid dogs was something no prisoner wanted to experience. Mauling by dogs. Mauling by dogs was not systematic like gas chambers, but served as a tool for terror, intimidation, and punishment, often resulting in death for individual prisoners. The Nazis employed specially trained attack dogs, predominantly German shepherds, conditioned to bite without mercy, causing fatal injuries through blood loss, infection, or shock. The use of dogs evolved from pre-war German police and military traditions, where breeds like German shepherds were prized for loyalty and aggression, traits Hitler admired. Hitler himself owned German shepherds like Blondie, which Nazi propaganda exploited, contrasting with how the regime weaponized animals against undesirables. By 1933, dogs were incorporated into SS Totenkopfverbände for guarding, with specialized dog handling units and training centers like Dachau, where handlers learned to command dogs to attack on cue. Deployment was widespread across the camp system. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, dogs patrolled perimeters and were set on prisoners, with Johanna Bormann using her German shepherd to maul women. At Bergen-Belsen, Irma Gräser and Bormann used dogs, with Gräser ordering maulings leading to deaths from rabies or sepsis. At Ravensbrück, dog bite experiments occurred, with survivors describing legs ripped open. The execution process was brutal and opportunistic. Dogs were trained to respond to commands like "Fass," attack, with handlers bonding with dogs while viewing prisoners as prey. Maulings occurred during roll calls, labor details, or escapes, with guards commanding dogs to attack specific body parts. Dogs bit and tore flesh, causing deep lacerations, with attacks lasting minutes but potentially prolonged. Survivor accounts provide harrowing details. One Ravensbrück survivor recalled, "The dog bite ripped apart my whole left foot." Abraham Koriski described SS staging sadistic shows with dog attacks, testifying, "They tortured us for entertainment," in a 2019 trial. And that was the same way the Nazi guards tortured prisoners for fun by electrocuting them. Electrocution. The Nazis did not employ electrocution as systematic execution, but deaths occurred primarily through contact with electrified fences surrounding concentration camps as security measures. These fences were charged with high-voltage electricity, often 380 for 500 volts, causing instant death upon contact due to cardiac arrest or severe burns. While many deaths were suicides driven by unbearable conditions, there are documented cases where SS guards forced prisoners onto fences as deliberate execution or punishment. The design was standard across major camps, creating deadly barriers serving multiple purposes. Barbed wire fences, often double-layered, were electrified with high-voltage current, with signs warning "Halt, Hochspannung, Lebensgefahr," stop. High voltage, danger to life. Touching caused immediate electrocution, with bodies often left as warnings. The most documented forced electrocution cases occurred at Mauthausen. At a 1947 tribunal, a witness testified, "I saw Franz Koffler beat 5 Jews and order them to jump into the wired fences. 2 were immediately electrocuted, but the other 3 held back. All were eventually thrown in." At Auschwitz-Birkenau, electrified fences surrounded subcamps, with many suicides, including photographed cases of inmates grasping wires. At Dachau, early use resulted in suicides and forced deaths, with bodies left hanging as warnings. For many prisoners, fences became the most accessible means of ending unbearable suffering. Prisoners facing daily brutality frequently chose fences as quick escape, making this the most common suicide method in camps. And worse than being electrocuted to death, the prisoners were forced to suffer more horrors by drowning in ice-cold water tanks. Drowning. During World War II, Nazis employed drowning in 2 primary contexts: medical experiments designed to support the German war effort, and ad hoc punishments in camps to terrorize and eliminate prisoners. The most systematic use occurred within Nazi medical experiments, particularly hypothermia experiments at Dachau. Prisoners were immersed in tanks of ice-cold water, temperatures ranging from 2 degrees to 12 degrees for periods of 51 to 95 minutes, or up to 5 hours. Victims were often naked, with body temperatures monitored until they dropped to lethal levels, 25 degrees to 28 degrees, at which point death occurred due to heart failure, often exacerbated by drowning as unconscious prisoners inhaled water. Led by SS Dr. Sigmund Rasche, these experiments were proposed by Luftwaffe Field Marshal Erhard Milch, approved by Heinrich Himmler, and reported at the 1942 Nuremberg Medical Conference. The goal was developing treatments for German pilots downed in cold seas, with approximately 280-300 prisoners subjected to 300 360-400 experiments, resulting in at least 80-90 deaths. The rewarming process was equally torturous. Rewarming tests included immersion in scalding hot water up to boiling, causing immediate death from thermal shock, while other methods involved forcing hypothermic victims into sexual contact to test animal heat transfer. Seawater experiments from July-September 1944 involved approximately 90 Romani prisoners deprived of food and fresh water, forced to consume only filtered seawater for days, leading to extreme dehydration, organ failure, and desperation. Conducted to test desalination methods for shipwrecked sailors, these experiments resulted in high suffering and mortality. Beyond experiments, drowning was used as punitive measure, particularly at Mauthausen-Gusen. At Gusen, ill prisoners were drowned in small water tubs by being held underwater until asphyxiation. In bathing punishments, groups of 40 to 200 prisoners were herded into showers until they collapsed and died from hypothermia or drowning. Primarily targeting Poles, Spaniards, Jews, and other non-Aryans, thousands died from the bathing method alone by 1943. SS Hauptscharführer Heinz Jentsch, nicknamed Bademeister, and SS Hauptsturmführer Karl Chmielewski oversaw the showers. Click on one of the cards on your screen to see more videos like this.